No, you
Yeah,
were
yeah,
not a
yeah.
man when you did this thing, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, yeah.
you should have kept your wife under control. Why didn't you do that, right? Because that's sort of
I'm
the
gonna make a short
patriarchal.
just cutting out those lines. Just it'll just be no context. You
Right.
ranting about yeah, exactly. Anyway. All right, we are going. Actually, we've got the summary as usual, but I did want to say,
Yep.
these our little commentaries are actually kind of taking off a little bit. The numbers
Yeah.
on some of them are actually getting up into the hundreds on occasion. So
Well, that's good, man. I mean,
yeah,
I think both of us are really just doing these commentaries for ourselves. I mean, these
of course,
discussions
yeah, yeah.
between me and you for ourselves, and I think we decided we just gamify it by making ourselves mutually accountable to show up and do these, um, forcing us to sort of go through the lectures very carefully and gather our thoughts very carefully, which really is the only motivation. In fact, I couldn't care less if nobody saw
Totally.
nobody saw these. This
No,
is
I mean,
literally just for me and you.
no, I will say on that note, actually, I was thinking this morning because I was not feeling it this morning when I woke up, let's say. But the discipline we were talking about in one of the early lectures, the lion of social obligation.
Yeah.
If I were trying to do this on my own, it would not be happening, right?
Yeah,
And
you'd be
so,
like, I'm not doing
but
it today. I'll
yeah,
even
totally.
share with you, I was thinking of calling you and postponing because I had some stuff I needed to take care of. But I'm like, no,
Yeah,
I committed
that's
to meeting
you know
him and I'm going to sit down and do it.
that's so interesting because I was too. And
Yeah.
so
In
the
fact, I
interesting
was I was kind of hoping you'd text me to cancel, but you didn't. And
yeah, no, I mean it's so I mean, but that's fascinating, right? How both of us were in that place of like, yeah, I'm not
Mhm.
really feeling this. I don't really want to do this. Like whatever. I don't want to put the energy in, etc. Focus. But then both of us actually ended up doing it just because the social obligation, right? So it's interesting that the social obligation is stronger than either of us in some sense, right? It is like
yeah,
both
I
of
mean,
us
when
were
you think about it, these sort of commitments involve three parties, right? It's me and it's you and it's the commitment. So there's three things, right? So I could let myself
yep,
down and you could let
totally.
yourself down and you could let me down and I could let you down.
Yeah,
But we're also
sure.
letting the commitment down as well, right? We're letting
The
down the
commitment down.
idea that
Yeah,
we
that's right.
committed to doing these at a regular basis and showing up at a predetermined time. So
And
that's a third party in this entire arrangement, right?
and to put that notion, I think in the language that we've been discussing is that is the role that commitment is a role, right? It's a commitment to an engagement and to an agent arena complex. The arena is the arena of these discussions, which we are recording, which we are putting out into the ether, whether anybody watches them or not. And we both have chosen to be in relation to that commitment, right? And it forms a tiny part of our identity, right? Is
Yeah.
do you keep your commitments? Do you, right? Whatever. Are you interested in this? Do you want to really pursue this? And then, I don't know. The notion of commitment has been playing around in my head a lot lately, in regard to the agent arena relationship specifically. Is it's not enough just to touch base on an agent arena relationship, but to really engage in the co-identification, there has to be a complete commitment. Not
Yeah,
even
I
not
guess
e-
that's
like a
where
like a
the language of coupling comes in, right? He talks about the agent arena coupling and
mm-hmm.
co-identification or whatever. That is a conscious act to some extent, right? It
Absolutely.
could be, it could not be. I mean, you could be just born into an
Yeah.
agent arena relationship that you didn't even choose. But when you are going through, say, a meaning crisis, or you're in a place where
Mm-hmm.
agent arena coupling is not readily available, you have to make conscious commitments then. I guess you have to also know what you're doing when you're doing that, right? And know that it's more important. In fact, this is an excellent way of thinking about it. Me and you both showing up at this predetermined time to do this lecture is about more than this lecture, right? It's not like the
Yes.
world is going to come crashing down if
Correct.
we like skipped a day or something, right? But that's not the point. right? The point is that, we have chosen to engage in this sort of agent arena relationship, right? And the continual re-engagement with this is what's important here.
And it defines us, maybe in relatively small ways. Right? I'm always reminded, one of my favorite quotes is Martin Luther, right? Where he was called to recant his heresies, and he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Right? And there is that notion is that once you've chosen a role, an agent arena relationship, and you are co-identified, there's a compulsion in that. This is who I am. If I don't keep my commitments, who am I? And if you keep breaking your commitments over time, you break one, okay, maybe your circumstance XYZ, but over time your identity starts to fracture. You start to not be sure who you are because you're not committed, you're not in any agent arena relationship. And maybe that's kind of where it just occurred to me, actually, why this notion of commitment and the agent arena coupling is so closely tied, is that you can't really co-identify without a very all-in commitment, in a way. Like, without saying, hey, I'm all in on this commitment to this agent arena relationship, it doesn't do the work of creating identity, right? It's not enough to just touch it and say, well, maybe we'll do a Vervaeke lecture if we feel like it, maybe someday, sometimes, right? Like, that doesn't create the co-identification. But if we make the commitment and then we uphold the commitment, then we're all in on this agent arena relationship, and it starts to form an identity, at the very least, of someone who keeps their commitments.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, there's also another angle in which we can be saying the same thing. Is he also talking about dynamical systems theory, right? Some guy, I forget which number lecture it was, but one of the ways that's determined is by the imposition of constraints, right? So if you constrain yourself in a certain way, then you grow because of that, right? Because now you're growing in the spaces where the constraints are pushing you towards. And if one constraint is, no, I have committed to this thing, and this commitment then imposes certain constraints, or we may use the word responsibility for it as well. Then if you keep affirming those, right, then you end up in a different, it's almost as if these are the set of initial conditions. If I play the wheel, if I just keep rolling the dice with these initial set of conditions, a certain pattern will emerge, right? And so it's adhering to those set of initial conditions that then determines what the pattern will look like if it's, if you keep rolling those set of initial conditions, right? If you keep the constraints where they are, right? And he talked about that as one model of character, right? Is that you just keep constraining yourself, and then as you do that, you then remember he was talking about the tree, Kant saw a tree and was very troubling to him, right? Because there was
that's right.
Because it did not fit the Newtonian sort of explanation, right? So. We went back to Aristotle for that. So, by the way, a little, just another way of saying the same thing again. There's multiple angles at this, but you said Martin Luther, and there was a very good quote of his I read the other day, which really spoke to me, which is very pertinent to this conversation, which is that he said, if I thought that the world would come to pieces tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree.
Yes.
Yes. It's really awesome, right?
Absolutely. Totally.
The outcome is not relevant.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
It's how you are.
It's who I am, right? That I'm still playing this role, not based on how well or badly it goes, but based on the connection I have to the agent arena relationship that I'm the agent arena relationships, the roles that I'm in. Anyway.
All right.
Anyway,
well, I got this summary as always.
Please.
Let's get cracking. We've already done substantial philosophy before we even started this lecture.
That's right.
All right. So what is it? Is this the 14th one or
14th? Yeah.
14. So this lecture is a discussion of the meaning crisis that emerged during the so-called Hellenistic Age. And before going much further, I'm sorry, my voice is really phlegmy today. But before going much further, it'd be good to characterize properly what is understood as the Hellenistic Age. The word comes from Hellen, which is an ancient word for a Greek person. And this age refers to the period of time after Alexander's conquests, when Greek culture found itself confronting other cultures that were very different from it for the first time, right? And so, unlike the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the Greeks who lived in the centuries after Alexander experienced a sense of what's called unhoming, in that they were no longer in their polis. In Athens, for example, where the religious beliefs, the culture, the norms, and the ethnicity of the neighbors and the ancestry of their neighbors was the same as theirs. The Greeks found themselves living in environments that were very alien to them for the first time, and they had to, en masse, grapple with reconciling these alien beliefs and environments in a way that was challenging. They were surrounded by the unfamiliar. They were surrounded by people, places, ideologies that were not theirs, and living in this environment had an effect of unhoming them. And another word for this is domicide, which resulted in existential angst and a meaning crisis of their own, which is why the Hellenistic Age is known as the Age of Anxiety. So this is when different schools of philosophy arose to tackle the problem. The Epicureans, the Cynics, and the Stoics, of which the Stoics seem to cast the longest shadow and seem to have the most persistently modern ideas. The Epicurean school was founded by Epicurus, who preached that the reason for our persistent, nagging existential anxiety, and here it should be noted that anxiety refers to a sense of unease about an amorphous threat for which there's no immediate solution, so contrasting anxiety from fear. So the Epicureans felt that the problem was that we feared, or we had an anxiety about death. And then they come up with some philosophical arguments, including a discounting of the idea of the afterlife to help diffuse our idea of death. So besides this diagnosis, the anxiety about death, they also had some other prescriptive solutions, the most stressed of which was joining or starting a community of people who shared the goal of forging philosophical friendships, and that such a community was paramount to helping overcome the anxiety. Epicureanism preached a somewhat detached way of being in the world, preaching a distancing from public affairs, and also trying to avoid psychological and physical pain as much as possible, the aponia and ataraxia. So in a way, and I'm positing my own interpretation here now, not Vervaeke, it seems that the Epicureans were trying to carve out a home for themselves, separate almost from the community, outside of the polis, with these communities where they surrounded themselves with people of similar ideological inclinations. So they were trying to recover the home, so to speak, right? They were sati the home, I suppose.
Yeah, good point.
So the Cynics had a different diagnosis, and they had a different prescription. The word cynic here has to also be recovered, refers to just living like a dog, right? So that just meant living deeply in accordance with just nature's laws. The most famous cynic, Diogenes, lived in a barrel, for example, just like a dog might crawl into a barrel to seek shelter. The Cynics thought that we run into problems. Their diagnosis here is that we run into problems because we set our hearts on the wrong things. We set our hearts on impermanent things like fame or fortune or even society. And the best course of action was to set our hearts on permanent things like natural laws. And it's understandable to me that they would come to this conclusion, because the once mighty empire of Alexander, which must have had a sense of permanence and inevitability when it was being forged, crumbled after he died. So it makes sense to me that there would be a distrust of even the most immense power structures like that of Alexander's empire. Vervaeke also explains why it was that Diogenes, the famous cynic, did some things that almost seemed to be performance art, like pretending to look for something in the marketplace with a lamp, and then answering when asked what he was looking for, he replied, "I'm looking for one honest man in the marketplace," right? So this was the Socratic method of being provocative, because Socrates would just get in your face and provoke you to wisdom, I suppose, or try to. They provoked people, the Cynics did, so they would be forced to reconsider things. Vervaeke here also points out that the Cynics believed in moral laws as well as just the natural laws. And they tried to explicate this to the people also by doing these performance arts kind of things. So Diogenes, for example, masturbated in the public. And what was going on there was that Diogenes was trying to highlight the difference between purity codes and moral codes. People in the marketplace, for example, might have been fine from the purity code perspective in that no one felt shame or disgust in the marketplace as they were engaged in business there, but that didn't make the marketplace a moral place. And Diogenes started to contrast the distinction by doing something shameful or disgusting, yet not immoral, in a place where people were engaged perhaps in immoral behaviors without feeling shame as they did so.
Yep.
So that's kind of what he was getting at over there, which is, I'm sure I would have never read this explanation anywhere else, by the way, except through Vervaeke. Yet another way in which he makes something very confusing seem extremely accessible, right? So the Stoics, though, internalized not the provocative nature of Socrates, but the argumentation and rationalization part of it. They were more inclined towards Plato than they were to the sort of provocative part of the Cynics. So they disagreed with the Cynics when it came to the diagnosis in a subtle yet very important way, a way that really makes all the difference, right? They also thought that fixing your heart to the wrong thing was the essence of the problem as well. It was the source of the existential angst. But they said that the solution wasn't to forego everything and live according to some natural law, but rather to engage with the society as we find it, but be mindful about the way in which we set our hearts on something. So they wanted a concentration on the process of us setting our hearts on something, because their argument was that that is a natural inclination. We are naturally social. We can't just pretend that we're unsocial creatures and assume a philosophy that just divorces us from society. We are part of society. That is our reality. We are attached to it in certain ways. And the key to conforming our way better is to be much more mindful about the way that we set our hearts on something. So they felt that the process by which we set our hearts on something is amenable to rational analysis. And using the power of reason, we can examine and therefore alter the heart setting that we do. So this is sort of my 30,000
Great
summary. I do have some thoughts otherwise, but I'll let you take off if you have any.
No, great summary. I won't also have a ton of commentary, so I don't want to hijack there. I think that the maybe the first comment I would make is it's interesting how we view Socrates primarily through Plato, historically, right? The rational side, the argumentative side. I think there's an argument to be made in some sense that just like Buddha, because why were Socrates' provocations taken so seriously? Why his, right? And for whatever reason, I think that there are certain people maybe who have had these insights, mystic experience, whatever it is, and then are able to kind of come to provoke to say, hey, let me see if I can get you to start having these experiences. And I'm not going to argue you, or I'm not going to fully rationally get you there, right? Even Plato is using analogy, he's using rationality, but he's not just telling you need to go do this, right? And the opportunity there is for over time when people don't understand as Vervaeke's explaining, the mystic aspects or the experiential aspects, to have different interpretations. Is the Stoics are taking one thing out of Socrates, the Platonists are taking something else, and the Cynics are taking something else, and it's like, well, to some degree, what's been lost is he was actually getting at something that was a unified experiential whole, not a propositional claim, right? And anytime somebody's after communicating a non-propositional thing, I think opportunity is for multiple interpretations to kind of manifest later on. That's just one commentary. But
yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, the Stoics and Epicureans basically took very different aspects of Plato's approach, right? One just said, hey, let's just provoke everybody. And I mean, Plato just took the propositional part, the rational part, and said, listen, I am going to use reason to convince you all that you are foolish, right? And
Yep.
that's really all I need. And if you read this book, you'll be convinced, right? So he,
Right.
not that, there was no real concept of science, right? But he sort of really doubled down on the rational approach. He said we can just get there through rationality. And I don't think that he was as emphatic about the performative or the participatory aspect of like arriving at some
Correct.
truths as much as, say the Cynics were, right? That was like literally
Sure.
performance theater kind of, right?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, Diogenes stories are, it's not those, only those two, right? Diogenes stories are my favorite. I love Diogenes stories, right? Like, I mean, like, so many, like, some guy is like, oh, you're a dog, you live like a dog, you smell like a dog, whatever. And Diogenes just like peed on his leg, and he was upset. He was like, why are you upset? I'm a dog. Like,
yet another example
just,
of the purity code versus moral code,
yeah. No, I mean, just,
conflation there.
and of course, the famous one is the one Vervaeke quoted, right? Which I have loved ever since I come across is, Alexander the Great, ruler of the world, essentially comes to you and it's like, the quote, at least as I've heard it, is Alexander came to him and said, if I could be anyone, I would be Diogenes. But since I can't, I have to be Alexander. But Alexander will give Diogenes anything he wants. What is his heart's desire? And Diogenes says, just move out of my light.
You're in my way.
Yeah, like, and that's exactly right. It's just get out of my way. That would be ideal, actually. All I can ask for is just don't stand in my way.
Well, so I had a couple of thoughts
Yeah.
about this as well. So the first one we'll come to is sort of the idea of the Hellenistic era, right? This was a new concept to me, right? And this is how Vervaeke teaches you philosophy and history in these lectures, right? Relevant philosophy and history, useful philosophy and history. I was not really aware of this, that there was such a thing as the Hellenistic Age, and I was very much struck by identifying very deeply and on a personal level with the experience of the Greeks at that time, right? And I will just, reveal some things to our audience here, which is that while I'm an immigrant to the United States, I moved here when I was 27. I was born in Saudi Arabia. I spent my childhood there. Then I went to Pakistan and I spent 10 years there. Then I came to the U.S. where I moved around quite a lot. And I joke to people who ask me where I'm from. And I joke and I say, well, it's going to take me 5 minutes to explain where I'm from.
Sure.
And then I end with saying, well, I don't really feel like I'm from anywhere, right? Because I haven't been to Saudi Arabia since I left when I was 17. Because I didn't grow up in Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't really feel like home. If I feel most at home, I feel most at home in America, but it would be a bit, in the sense of this Hellenistic Age discussion, I still have a sense of unhoming, right, of domicide, in the sense that I never had a home that ended up having a side to it, right, a domicide to it. And I contrast it very much with, again, this motif comes up so in such a useful way, my dad's village, right? Which I've brought up many times in this discussion. Again, my dad lives in came from a village that's very traditional, and it's still the same way of life as it was 50, 60 years ago with some minor changes. But over there, everyone believes the same thing. Everyone is part of a family structure. The kind of jobs that people do are, familiar to the people there. The religion is the same, the ethnicity is the same, the language is the exact same dialect, right, which is a very unifying thing, by the way. We don't think about that often enough, but if you're speaking the exact same dialect I'm speaking and 15 kilometers away it's a different dialect, then the dialect language alone is almost like a
my dad's even said home. Like that like he you could place people by their like if you just talk to somebody within like a small, very small kilometer radius, you're like, this is where you were born, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of interesting.
So it contrasts that with my experience, right? And I was sort of thinking as I went through this whole idea of domicide is to what extent like I have suffered from this. I don't use the word suffer, but to what extent I've experienced this, right, as well. And while my experience might be perhaps a bit extreme in that I never really felt like I had a solid foundation of a cultural identity that I really, just case in point, my dad raised me speaking English, right, which is why I speak English the way I do. I still speak in English with my dad, even though that's not our native language, because that's just how he wanted us to grow up, because he knew we were going to go to an English school. And so even the language is something where my dominant language is not the language of my culture that I come from.
That's
right?
profound.
And all of these are
profound.
All of these are in parentheses, right? Because it's not like I come from that culture really in a deep sense, right? And so I really have I'm still processing to what extent this is responsible for some of my own existential anxieties, right?
Sure.
Because the contrast to this as well is that I feel like I'm someone with a very open personality, and I think that if I was to be put into a rigid social structure and be told like this is how it is, right? This is the role that society is giving you. You are now like in this village, and these are the ways you must behave that's appropriate to this environment. I think I would chafe at that a lot, right?
Totally.
I would be like, no, like I want my. So there's this tension between like, you could plug in to a society with all the rules and, cultures and traditions and even the dialect of the language baked in, and you could just walk right in and embrace it and own it. But then, you can't then go and do your own thing, right? You can't like be a part of my dad's village. And then as we're having tea in the afternoon with some of the village elders, talk about atheism. Like, hey, is this God really exist, right? You're going to cause a riot.
That's
right. You're going to cause a riot, right? If you do that in that environment, right?
Totally.
So there's that tension there, right? Which is kind of the classic tension between to what extent does a sense of individualism contribute to society, because it's individualistic drives and pressures that does kind of move the cutting edge of society and ideas forward. I mean, we need people to break out of the mold and carve new paths, right? Like every religion was first, every great truth, this is another quote, I don't know who said it, every great truth was first a blasphemy. Right?
Yeah, sure.
And
Very
so, but you need someone to be blasphemous, and that means breaking the agent arena coupling and then reforging a new one. But that's a painful process, right?
And so there's a lot to jump on there. But what's interesting on some level is that Alexander did break and engage in this sort of domicide and all of these things in the Hellenistic period, and yet on some level that's a part of the dynamical process. That is the disruption portion that we've been talking about on a societal level. We've been talking about it on an individual level in terms of psychedelics or in terms of like these other experiences. But on a societal level, it's the same thing. It's this, oh, hey, now everything is disrupted, and now you have to form a more abstract. Society has to grow, expand, and say, okay, I was Athenian. And by I mean maybe my father, maybe a generation, right? But I was Athenian, and now I am Greek. There's a different definition, because the Athenians did not consider themselves Greeks. They considered themselves Athenians. Right. That was, the polis was the definition. It was a nation state, right? Or sorry, a city state, right? And to move from city state to nation state,
just like some Texans consider themselves Texans.
No, totally. Yeah, I mean, there are overlaps there, right? And so, this notion of co-identification, and then when your co-identification is disrupted and you are unhomed, and you undergo this death of your home, you have to forge a new identity somehow, some new agent arena complex, and that's the dynamical process at work. The dynamical generative system at work is disruption, regeneration, and by the way, at higher levels of abstraction, right? That's the other interesting thing, is that it is just like linguistic, just like math, just like these other things. It's at a higher level of abstraction. It's not just the people you know, it's some other more abstract sense of connectedness to...
Does it always abstract up, do you think, when it reconfigures?
Well, the risk is this. I mean, we can debate this, actually. I don't know. My immediate response, my off-the-cuff kind of thought, is that we hope it does, but the risk is that it doesn't. The risk is that the disruption is just death, and that society collapses, right? And we are hoping that there's a disruption reconfiguration, but we don't know in the moment. It could just be disruption collapse. Right?
Which has happened, right? Like the pre-axial societies all collapsed, right? And so if we sort of think about societies as, ideologies or belief systems that are operating on certain assumptions, right? They may be, setting their hearts on the wrong thing, right? And operating that way. And just to, bring back our discussion to the very beginning, if they have a certain set of initial conditions and you just play that out, that algorithm, quote unquote algorithm, if you can call it that, may just result in that society just completely collapsing, right? And that's probably why there was this axial age work of trying to figure out, okay, how can we have better insight into the processes, right? And that's probably the Socratic axial age movement right there.
But even taking it down to an individual level, there are people who have bad experiences on psychedelics, right? And they have a hard time recovering. Their identity fractures and they don't know how to put it back together, right? And so that does happen as well. And so the hope is that most people are able to put it back together, especially if they have social support, especially if they have some way of talking about the experience or therapy after, whatever the deal is. But yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're disrupting people at a basic level, we can high post or we can praise the ones that come back together and gain and grow and do well. And they're like, oh, I'm so glad I went through that experience. But there are also the fraction that get fractured and don't get put back together. And that's true individually. It's also true socially. And that's the terror. That's the fear of it. And it's real. I mean, there's a real fear there.
Oh, yeah. The universe does not owe us to have stable human societies. In fact, multiple times it's proven to us that the norm is actually for societies to collapse, right? Or at least break down in such catastrophic ways that a complete reconfiguration is required, right, by the surviving members.
There's a great, I think it's a comic, at least that's how I saw it. I don't know what the original source was, but it says, a man says to the universe, "Sir, I exist." And the universe replied, "However, that does not confer on me any sense of obligation."
Did you just misgender the universe?
I don't think I did. I said a man said to the universe.
Oh, the man said to the universe,
yes.
"Sir."
Sir, I exist. Oh, yeah. Actually, he misgendered. Yeah, I was just quoting. I was just quoting.
That still makes it bad enough. You should still be canceled.
Correct.
Sorry, I interrupted you. What did the universe say?
So is it, "Sir, I exist," and the universe replied, "However, that does not confer on me any sense of obligation."
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's exactly correct. Right. That's exactly correct. So I had a thought here. I'm really curious to see what you thought, because I'm surprised Vervaeke didn't bring it up, right? Which was that I thought that there was like very obvious parallels between the Stoic idea or even the Cynic idea of setting your heart on something and Buddhism. And I'm not sure if it's obvious to you what the parallels are here, right? So
I thought the same. Yeah.
Okay, great. So
non-attachment.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to flesh this out a little bit, because I'm using my own vernacular here that I introduced a couple of lectures ago, where when phenomenologically we're experiencing not just our inner life but an outer life, we are experiencing through sort of a narrow sort of lens, what I call frame, right? And when I'm meditating now, and the constellation of feelings and emotions and thoughts come up to present me with a reality, I now can recognize it when it presents, and I in my mind I label it with frame. I'm like, oh, I have framed a certain perception, and just giving it that label allows me to just see it from afar, right? But there's really no difference between this frame analogy that I use and setting your heart, right? Because the attachment in both sense, like, the Buddha said, we are constantly at risk of, being of dukkha, all the time. And what he meant is that we're constantly at risk of falling into a frame and thinking that the frame is reality and just comporting our lives as if this is true life. And he says that if you engage in these sort of wisdom practices, meditation practices, you can realize that we artificially construct these frames. These frames are not real, they're constructs. And you can take this so far back that you realize that your own sense of self is a frame, and in a real sense, illusory in a sense, right? Which is not to say that it's not useful, but it is. It's a frame at the end of the day. You can scale back so much that you can even recognize your own self as a frame, and the attachment that the Buddha was talking about was our attachment to these perceptions of reality, these frames, right? And I feel like there's no difference between what that statement says and what the Cynics and the Stoics were talking about when they said setting your heart to something, right? Like the problem or the existential angst is setting your heart on something. And then the Cynic says, don't set your heart on these things like culture and government and society or whatever. Just set your heart on natural laws and moral laws. Whereas the Stoics are like, listen, let's actually live in society. That's probably a good thing. And let's instead question the frame, or question how we set the heart, how we set our hearts on things, right? And try to explicate the setting of our frames, and try to attack that with rationality and question and like, hey, is this situation really how I think it is, right? Which is why the Marcus Aurelius would say, well, the act of sex is the rubbing together of skin parts, right? Because he was trying to just break frame so much by just, explaining something that we find deeply meaningful like sex in purely physiological and physical terms, right? To say, well, this is also one way of looking at it, right? Let's break the frame and think of it in this other completely arbitrary way. So I thought it was really striking how much overlap there was in these ideas between the Stoics and the Buddhists.
And actually, yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think, and again, I think that's, and he's done a brilliant job, by the way. This is, again, the Vervaeke's kind of brilliance, is he's presenting these themes as like, okay, this was the Hellenistic, this was the Buddhist, but they overlap because they're dealing with the same issues. So as there is inevitably convergence, if you're converging on truth, you're converging, right? However, I do think that and this may be interesting to flesh out, the Epicureans, I think, got something right that the Cynics and maybe the Stoics even did not on some level, and maybe even the Buddhists to some degree. And that is the notion that, sorry, this is a complex thought, so you'll have to bear with me as I try to put it together, but he said that, the Epicureans said that we have a fear or an anxiety about death, right? And one solution to that was to pursue immortality. And one version of that is and he says it's a flawed solution, right? It's an attempt that people make. And whether that's a belief in an afterlife, right, which is the old solution, or it made me think a lot of the longevity movements now, right? Where it's like, oh, let me focus all my attention on how we can live forever and how I can upload my brain and how I can, whatever, right? It's, hey, let me not deal with this anxiety. Let me figure out how to, it's that attempt to end around the actual issue, right? However, their solution was actually you need to just radically accept, right? Radical acceptance of death and that notion, right? And I think, and what you are afraid of is the loss of agency, the loss of your agent arena relationships, right? But if you radically accept that all of your, and this is where I'm kind of branching out a little bit, radically accepting not only your physical death, right, but that each and every one of your agent arena relationships is mortal. So you have maybe even, and the overarching agent arena relationship, which is the self, is also mortal, right? But then it's also, hey, you and I are doing we just started the video with with this is, hey, you and I are doing these podcasts. Well, there's a mortality to it. It ends at 50. It's not forever, right?
Yeah.
So that part of my identity will die. And it's a very enjoyable part of my identity. It's commitment. There's meaning. There's fulfillment. I get a lot out of these discussions, and it will end, right? That's also an awareness of what it is to have that agent arena coupling. How much more so for a home, and that is very true of your childhood home, right? I grew up in this particular environment, and it ends, and at some point you become an adult. And then you can form a new home, but it's not going to be your childhood home, right? It's because you're the one in charge of forming. You're no longer a child passively receiving the home that is given to you. Someone else has built it, and you just came into it, right? You have to build a home. You have to set up a relationship. You have to create structure. You have to create security. You have to do all the things that are associated with a home, ideally for your partner, for your children, right? And it's not going, and then you're not a child in that home. So So even though you recover a home, you can never recover that home, right? Because you're not a child anymore. You have a different agent arena relationship with home. So looping all the way around, there's a super interesting interview with Theo Von, of all people. And he said that he realized at some point that he was not succeeding. He was not moving forward in his life because he was waiting on fulfillment of his childhood home. That dream had never come to the reality that he needed from that experience. And he came to realize that he kept waiting for his parents or for whoever to come back and say, hey, sorry, we didn't set this up for you correctly. Let me give you this fulfillment so that then you can grow out of your childhood home and move on to adulthood with some sense of closure for that agent arena complex. And he said, I realized I was wasting my adulthood because it wasn't coming. That was just never going to happen, right? And I was not building the adulthood home. I was not building toward that new rehoming because I was waiting on the old home to somehow magically come be fulfilled, right? And by letting go of that notion and saying, look, that's just not going to happen. My parents are who they are. The situation was what it was. I'm not going to get to be a child who leaves home. I never had the home to leave. It just didn't get set up correctly. But I'm missing out on my adulthood because I'm still waiting on my childhood. And so he was able to kind of overcome that. And I think that this notion ties into, if you accept that agent arena relationship has died, right? That's a radical acceptance. The radical acceptance of death is that there's no afterlife for your childhood home. It's dead. It's gone, right? Now you can set up a new agent or relationship, and that will also die, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to accept that, like, even when you set up a trivial example, but people who experience quite a bit of depression with empty nest syndrome. Well, we set up this agent arena relationship. Now it died, right? What do we do? Well, we got to set up things differently, right? And each one of those has a life cycle, and I think the Epicureans got it right, whereas the Cynics on some level, and even the Stoics maybe even, are trying to avoid the pain of death by changing the form of attachment instead of radically accepting that, hey, I want this frame. This frame provides value to me. This frame provides meaning to me. I am choosing this frame. And yes, they get it right that you should be aware of it as a frame. That's true, right? You shouldn't make the Buddhist mistake. You shouldn't think that the frame is reality with a capital R, right?
Right.
But having the frame provides identity, provides value, provides meaning, and you have to buy into it and agree to belong to it and agree to its death in order to really get the full benefit. If you're constantly trying to hold off and say, well, maybe I can find the perfect frame that will be immortal, then you miss out on all these agent arena relationships, and I think you end up losing meaning in that sense. So, sorry, complex thought. I went on for a while there, but
yeah, no, I actually didn't think about that. Although, Marcus Aurelius, as he was dying, right, he also died of the plague that was going around at that time. So he didn't die suddenly, in some battle. It took him a few days to die, and he saw it coming. And he had a lot of equanimity during the time, supposedly, when he died, right? So something about the Stoic philosophy also allowed him to prepare for death as well, right? Because I guess, one way that he and the Stoics kind of dealt with fear of death is not getting attached to life to begin with too much, right?
So
maybe that was their solution.
But this is exactly the question. Actually, this is exactly the question that I'm trying to point at. Is that makes me, I wonder if that's the right idea. That's exactly my question. Because there's that Dylan Thomas idea, right? Is do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rage at close of day, right? And there's a notion there that, like, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe that's not a good goal. And by having that detachment, yes, you have equanimity at your death, but maybe you've also missed out on sucking the marrow out of life, right? Or there's an Ursula K. Le Guin to the same thing, is that by avoiding suffering, you also avoid the chance at joy. An explorer who will not come back can never know what it means to come home, and his sons are born in exile. Right? Or sorry, an explorer who will not come back is not an explorer. He's merely an adventurer. He cannot know what it is to come home, and his sons are born in exile. Right? It's an interesting notion, is that yes, to be home, you have to commit, you have to belong, you have to accept that losing this will hurt, and it should hurt, because otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I do recognize the value of like fully embracing, the ephemeral nature of everything, right? Your life and all of the age-interregional couplings. You may go through a series of them. I think it's profoundly wise to recognize that they are temporary, but then it's difficult for me to then also figure out if they're temporary. Like, one of the potential pitfalls that stand in front of you if you assume that posture is not caring enough, right? Because it's a short walk from, well, it's all temporary and impermanent, to nihilism, right?
And that's
I'm just saying that they're cousins
totally
of each other. I'm not saying that one leads to one the other.
But that's exactly kind of what I'm pointing at, is that comes from this fear of death that the Epicureans were kind of is the anxiety about the death of that agent arena coupling. The temporary nature of it makes you want to take a step back emotionally and not belong to it, right? Rather than the radical acceptance of, yes, you are going to die, this relationship is going to die, this interaction is going to die, and you need to suck every minute you can out of it and let it hurt when it dies. Embrace it. That's all these. Embrace the suck, right? Let it hurt. Because you're going to have a more fulfilling life if you just let it hurt sometimes. Whatever. There's so many. Garth Brooks' song, "The Dance," right? I could have missed the pain, but then I'd have missed the dance, right? And there's all these ideas that I think point at, hey, yeah, these are temporary, and if you are aware they're temporary, don't react to that by pulling back. Don't react to that by creating detachment. React to that by embracing the pain and push into it and say, I'm going to get everything out of it while it is here. And I think that's the fundamental gap that I have with Buddhism or with Stoicism or any of these other things is, yes, I agree with the diagnosis, but I disagree with the solution.
I wonder to what extent the Epicureans were able to transcend, or embrace the ephemeral nature of all of the agent arena coupling by being part of their sort of philosophical friends community, right? What Epicurus himself called the garden. Because, I didn't really find their philosophical arguments, let's say you should not fear death because, hey, you were not alive before you were born and you're not going to be alive for thousands of years after your death, and you're not going to experience any suffering, so your fear is irrational, therefore you should not be afraid of death. I don't think such a neat, cute philosophy really does any serious heavy lifting in really alleviating the source of death, right? It could be that was the on its face philosophical construction they came up with, but then they were able to ameliorate the meaning crisis that they were experiencing by really just creating another home for themselves in their communities, right? And that's really what did all the work, right? And then if you ask them all why it is that, you were embracing life, they will spin some philosophy, but really it was the participation of their community that in a participatory way relieved them of the existential angst that they were feeling at the time, right? And so it was perhaps that more than that was doing the heavy lifting more than the propositional philosophy that alleviated their angst, right? In addition, they had a few other prescriptions as well, like lead a simple life, try to get pleasure from simple things, not extravagant things. They had a very strong emphasis on friendship. One of the things I read about Epicurus is, he wrote a letter. Do you know about this? The letter he wrote when he died? So he was dying of like dysentery, just some terrible, like he was just shitting his pants on the day of his death, right? And he wrote a letter to some friend of his in the community who was no longer there. And he was like, on this last day of my life, I'm thinking about, the conversations we had together and how much joy it brought me and blah, 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 right? So just sort of, it's telling. He was not talking about the philosophy, right? He was talking about the community on the last day, right? And that's why I didn't really find the propositional parts of Epicureanism very appealing. I'm like, okay. I mean, the other part of it is as well is like they also say, well, there's no purgatory or hell, so you just don't worry about that, right? That's all it.
Well, and again, I think it's funny because I think they started on the right answer and then again made the same diversion. Is they say, radically accept death, right? But we're going to radically accept it by saying, it won't be that bad. That's not actually radically accepting it. Radically accepting it is it's going to fucking suck. But if you accept that it's going to suck, then you can live a rich life now, right? And say, hey, let's engage with friends and community. Let's do these things. And then at the very least, when the suck comes, you can say, well, I sucked the marrow out of life. I lived to the fullest, right? To the deepest, most meaningful way. And that's why it sucks right now, is I wasn't at a half step back from life. I was in it, right? And so, I'm losing something now. Now I'm losing something of value, right? Whereas if you're at a half step back and you say, well, I'm just not going to hold that in very high esteem, okay, maybe it hurts less when you lose it because you weren't valuing it very highly.
Yeah, I mean, I sense resistance to this, right? I think that when it comes to when it comes to the end of agent arena relationships with respect to, say, relationships or, your career or, your position in society comes to an end in some way, right? It's easy to feel that loss and move on, right? But when you're dying, I don't know how much solace you're going to have by saying, well, yes, I'm dying and it really sucks, but at least when I was alive, I sucked the marrow. I'm not sure if that solace is going to be, because, your frame here is that, listen, your death really sucks, right? But hey, at least before you died, you did all these great things. You really sucked the marrow out of life. And, if the job of philosophy is to prepare you for death, the question I ask myself is, at the moment of death, is that proposition going to give you the equanimity you need to be able to face death, right? Which is, I think honestly, that's the most important job of philosophy. That's what I'm trying to get out of it as well, is when I'm dying and I'm in fact, maybe this should be a stated goal, right? Yeah. When I'm dying, right? And it may, hopefully it's not grievous, but let's even assume that it is grievous. When I am dying my grievous death, will I be the calmest person in the room or not? Like, will I be Socratic? Right? I mean, he was literally the calmest person in the room, right? Socrates, when he was dying, right? He kicked his wife out, like, woman, you're crying too much, right? And perhaps that's really, I will feel like philosophy has done its job when, if I am dying with a calm mind, right? And, maybe that's not the goal of philosophy for other people, but I have very,
I have very bizarre views on this topic, which I'll loop back around to. But I can give you direct examples of observed situations. One I find still, every time I think of it, I get emotional. I find very moving, right? There was a patient that I saw in Brownwood, Texas. Small town, came into the ER, heart failure exacerbation, fluid overload, EF of ejection fraction, so the number we follow was like 15, something like that, right? It turns out it was a transplanted heart, right? So it was a heart transplant. The guy had the heart transplant when he was young. It was idiopathic heart failure. He was in his 20s, I think. And the heart lasted like 30 years, right? Which is far beyond the reasonable expectation of a heart transplant. And he was now 50. I mean, he wasn't that old, right? And because he had taken such amazing care of his heart, he'd played everything by the book, across the board, perfect candidate, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't whatever, everything across the board, and had done so for 30 years and kept this heart going.
Right.
You know, his transplant team in Dallas offered him a new heart to say, hey, let's get back on the list. Like, we could do this again, and you could have another 10 years. Like, no guarantee the new heart will last as long as this one, but, you know, you've taken great care of it, like, you whatever. And he actually refused. He said, no, at the time I got the heart transplant, it was because I wanted to raise my kids. And they're grown, they're in college, they're okay now. Let someone else have the heart. Let someone else have their shot, because I got my shot. Right? Like that, like literally I tear up like when because that's the right perspective, right? Is that no, I got everything I needed out of, and I'm not going to take someone else's shot, right? And so I think that in that way, when you really feel like you've sucked the marrow out of life, that does give you a certain equanimity about death, is that I did what I was supposed to do. I have not left things undone in some sense, right? I was not at one remove from life. I had my fights with my kids. I raised them. I did all the things. I was in it, and now I can let go with a bit of peace, because and I will say, I think some of the better Stoics did this, whether they talked about it or not. I think that they were very much in life and were able to find that space.
One of the ideas that strikes me, you mentioned earlier about the longevity movement in medicine, right? Where we're all trying to live to be 500 years old, and there's a lot of like movement on this. And, I'm a bit more optimistic about that whole human enterprise than you are. I don't think we'll achieve immortality necessarily, but I do think that we could probably substantially increase, human lifespan, right? Maybe we may get to 150 or 200, but I suspect, based on some of these conversations, that as these solutions start to be unveiled, right, and the promise of potentially achieving true longevity, like deep longevity, right, 1,000 years, right? Let's, for example, assume in 50 years there's a certain collection of people in the world that actually do believe that this is possible, right? I predict that the existential angst will go through the roof when that happens,
Totally.
right? Because I think part of the way to achieve meaning in life is to really reconcile with your mortality, right? But if you're living in this empirical age that promises you immortality, which it cannot do, like even if we fixed aging, let's assume, right?
Sure.
You can still be like hit by like a bus,
Totally.
right? So it will eventually happen, right? There's a billion years from now you will die, right? And most of the time philosophy is operated in the space of normal human lifespans. If you were to increase that normal human lifespan, quote unquote normal human lifespan, by 50 or 60%, I think that would probably unleash a whole new wave of existential angst. As people try to reconcile the tension between possibly being immortal, at least theoretically, right, with like, is the technology going to come fast enough, for me, or am I just going to like die before like the philosopher's stone is invented, right?
Yeah. Totally. I think even more, I think there's even interesting, the guy I rag on all the time, what's his face?
Huberman.
Oh, no, I like ragging on him too, but no, Brian Johnson.
Oh, yeah. Right.
You look at what his day looks like and how much energy he's putting toward this notion of immortality, right? And to me, it feels rather empty, right? It's a fearful clawing away at the notion of fearing death,
right,
to the point you've dedicated every waking moment, and I don't think that's a very meaningful existence, right? I think it's fixated on this fear. And I think that, again, the Epicurean diagnosis is that the problem is the fear, right? The problem is not death. The problem is the fear, right?
Yeah, right.
And so how do we deal with that? Is that like, well, if you spend every moment building agent arena relationships, a community, et cetera, improving the life. And again, I love this definition. I feel like this is my practice. My Vervaeke's essence is let no man call himself a philosopher if he has not alleviated someone else the pain in someone else's heart. Right? I mean, the physician of the soul is exactly right. That's exactly right. And what opportunity is there for you to do that if you're fearfully clawing away at avoiding your own death?
If you're so busy trying to stay alive, you forgot to actually live while you were doing it, right?
Exactly. Great, well put. Exactly right. And so, I think that this notion is a continuation of that same flawed thing. Is I don't want to deal with the expansion of myself, the radical acceptance of death, the need to form agent arena complexes, the need to accept that whatever I form is going to be impermanent in some way. Instead, I'm going to spend all my time dreaming about this sort of theoretical idea that I won't have to deal with it. Maybe we can just live forever, and then I won't have to deal with this angst, which is obviously, as you point out, obviously flawed. The minute you got immortality, you would immediately be confronted with, well, now you have to deal with this existential angst forever.
Yeah.
So
right.
It's actually compounded the problem, right?
Yeah. I mean, then you're going to have like a real deep fear of accidents, right? Like, if I go out there and get hit by a bus, what was this all for, right? I am foregoing thousands of years of potential life by getting in this car, right? And
that's right.
Like the stakes are now so much higher that you might just be frozen into inaction, right? Because you're like, no, it's why would I risk immortality, right?
Totally. I've talked with Jassim about this too, is that, hey, if we all live forever, here's an interesting thing. I think in some very interesting way, it's possible that all human progress would stop. Because if I say, hey, like, well, I can always work on that boring part of the project later. There's always later, right? I just want to do the interesting part. I just want to work on learn whatever's interesting. I just want to do, and then when I get bored with that, I'll move on to the next thing because I could come back forever, right? There's no urgency to finish anything, right? The same is true of like, non-capitalist systems. If there's universal wealth in some way, it's like, why would anybody finish anything? Because there's no pressure on it to do the boring parts, to do the difficult parts, right? And I think you end up with similar situations even in the dating market, right? Is if you see that, like the most handsome model, rich, whatever guy, right? Well, why should I put up with an annoying girlfriend? If she's being annoying, get rid of her. There's another one around the corner, right? Like, or if you're a beautiful girl, like why would I commit to dealing with this if there is infinite space, right? And our brains don't do well with infinite space, right? We tend to suck the meaning out of our lives because the meaning comes from the roles we adopt and the responsibilities we take on, the agent arena couplings we commit to through ups and downs, which are constraining.
Which have to be constraining, right? Like you have to make a choice, right? You have to consciously limit your freedom, right? In order for any of this to make sense, right? And so there's two ideas there. Like the one is you have to give up your freedoms. And the second is you have to believe in free will that you can, right? And like I said, even though I'm still an atheist and everything, like one of the things I've taken a leap of faith on is the idea of agency, that no, I have free will, I have agency. I have no proof for you, but I am going to assume this posture as an initial set of conditions and operate my life accordingly because I feel like the resultant pattern, on the nth step will be better than if I don't do that, right?
Totally.
Another thought I had here was coming again to my dad's village and the whole notion of unhoming, which, by the way, is like a acutely felt experience in the modern world, right? Because how many people in the world today, in the Western world today, are living in the same town or village that they were born and raised in, right? And one of the issues of globalization is you can just pick up and go and set up roots somewhere else, right? There's there's also this whole notion of nomad workers and working from home, and Americans move every few years to some other place, right? And That's true on a micro scale in a nation state, but it's also true on a global scale where cultures are sort of merging with each other in the same way that they did after Alexander's empire, collapsed. So this unhoming crisis and the resultant, the great unhoming and the resultant existential angst that it generates, right, is echoed all over again in this day and age as well. So we're really contending with the same problems, and it's not a coincidence that Stoicism is on the ascendant, right, in an age such as this, right, because we're sort of mirroring the same kind of conditions. But one thought I had about this, the sense of having a home and then having homicide is, I was thinking about, again, my dad's village, and, the tendency that I've detected over there and, people of that culture, right? And I'm even talking about my mom's side of the family who also live in a very well-defined cultural milieu, the same dialect and everything, but it's a few kilometers away, so it's a different dialect.
Different world.
Different
We're not
world,
even sure
actually.
those people are human. Who knows what's going on over there.
The thing that I noticed over there was that amongst the many cousins that I have, whenever we're sitting down together, and even in my dad's village, this is the case when people of the same village are sitting together, sometimes I will hear one person criticizing another person. It's like, oh, that thing you did, that was like a stupid thing that you did, right? Or, oh, you shouldn't have done that thing, right? And, they're not brothers necessarily. They just happen to live in the same environment, right? But a person will still feel willing to and feel that it is appropriate to criticize or speak to the actions of another person. And here in the West, we kind of interpret that as well. These people are very intrusive, they don't have good manners, or they should just mind their own business, or some flavor of that sentiment, right? But I've started to think about it now after watching this lecture of Vervaeke and thinking about unhoming in a very different way, which is that the person who's criticizing that other person is doing it standing on the ground of a common agent-arena relationship, right? He is engaged with the same arena as that other person. So it's like, a one Greek in, Socrates, Athens, criticizing another Greek as well, because they all have the same set of assumptions about how the reality is, right? And so there's no confusion. It's like, well, maybe this guy just has a different opinion about, like, the gender roles or whatever, right? Right? There's none of that. There's like, no, you were not a man when you did this thing, right? You should have kept your wife under control. Why didn't you do that, right? Because that's sort of the.
I'm gonna make a short, just cutting out those lines. It'll just be no context. You ranting about exactly.
But. You contrast it with, if you meet a total stranger, right? And you've been out in the public, right? You go to a meetup group or something.
Unwillingly.
And you meet a total stranger here in Austin, right? Or say New York or some other city that has some degree of cosmopolitanness to it. You are not going to assume that person has the same belief system as you do.
Correct.
So to criticize that person and say, well, maybe you should do this, that, or the other, is to assume that you know them first, and that feels intrusive, and it feels like you are making assumptions about a person's identity that seem almost impolite, right? You are assuming that they belong to a certain agent in a relationship, and so that kind of made me think about, that is another symptom of unhoming as well. If you can't, go to some stranger in your society, like you're driving down the street of your village, and then someone's trying to change a tire and doing it completely terrible. They don't know how to change a tire, right? And you stop to help them, but you're also going to criticize them for not knowing how to change a tire, because what the hell, like, right? You're not going to do that if you decide to help someone in New York, right? You're like, oh well, maybe your parents didn't teach you, or
correct,
whatever it is, right? Whereas in a small village, they'd be like, how do you not know how to do this? Because
I'm doing it, but I'm also telling you you're an idiot, right? I mean, like,
right.
Yeah.
So
totally.
that sense of judgment is a lot more. It's an easy road to walk, because the underlying set of assumptions are the same, and that is part and parcel of the home, right?
I think you can take that even a step further. Actually, is in that that judgment, that criticism, is a part of belonging. Is I have to criticize you, otherwise I don't belong. I'm not upholding the agent arena complex.
That's right.
Right? So
In fact,
I'm actually in
that
some way
criticism-
obligated to. Yeah.
That criticism is a reaffirmation of the ideals
Exactly.
of that, yeah.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. And I think that what's interesting is that comes to a head very much with the notion of raising kids.
Yes, absolutely.
Who can discipline the kids? If there's a kid running around screaming in the restaurant, right? Well, now we're all like, well, I don't know what the parents' values are. Maybe they're gentle parenting. Maybe they're, it's a pro screaming parent. I don't know. Like, we don't want to suppress the child's individuality, whatever the deal is, right?
Yeah, some people believe that, right? And you don't know
exactly
if that
right.
parent feels that way. This is a phenomenal time to remind you of this anecdote. Have you ever seen Mad Men, the Stevie series?
I haven't seen it all the way through, but
in the very beginning, right, of the series, in the first 2 or 3 episodes, they really try to exaggerate or try to jar the reader into reminding them that things were very different in the 1960s, right? And they would do a few things. Like one of the things that really burns in my memory, right, which is an excellent example of this, what you just said, is that, they were having a get-together in someone's house and, kids were getting unruly and like running around and knocking things over. And then one of the parents, right, who was not the parent of the kid, stopped the kid and slapped him.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And the actual parent was standing right there next to his friend who slapped his son.
Like,
and
yes, thank you for slapping him for me. Saved me the effort.
Exactly. The parent basically said, Timmy, what do you say? Right? Basically saying, hey, you should apologize for creating a ruckus, right? And and he would say, sorry, Mr. So-and-so. Right? That's a perfect example of like those people in that part of the America, white people living in the suburbs, had a very definite agent arena model, right? And they all like bought into it, right?
And that's and that speaks to why we have such a hard time now forming communities. Right. Is because that's what it takes to have a community. We all have to agree on our agent arena relationship to that degree, to the point that we accept the rightness of other people disciplining our kids. That's what creates that sense of community. And that comes with giving up a certain amount of individuality. Is like, no, like maybe I have certain different values, but then you can't have that community. And there's a huge trade-off there. I mean, that's the individual community kind of tension that is always there, right? But then we have so much trouble raising kids. I mean, it's very time consuming because you get zero help from the village. There's no village, right? It's just okay. Maybe you can come to some agreement with your spouse about what the values and how you're raising kids. Even that is difficult now, right? But maybe the two of you can work something out that you both agree on, or can live with at the very least. But nobody else is going to share that, and so then it's just the two of you raising the kids because you're not willing to let anybody else in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean that's part of the meaning crisis as well. It's no coincidence, like the Buddha said, right, that you have to have a sangha, right, a community, in order to do these things, right, in order to like achieve full enlightenment, right. And in that sense he meant a community of monks and everything, but that definition has been expanded. But even the Epicureans said the same thing, right? And it's telling how these different traditions are all saying that, listen, community is like a really important part of the puzzle here, right? You can do all of your work that you're doing, right? But you meditate and do all the philosophy and build your character and everything, right? But it's like the phrase, no man is an island, right? In that sense, in order to achieve an agent arena coupling, there's some community that is required. And part of the great unhoming that is part and parcel of the meaning crisis in the current age is it's very difficult to find communities, right? Especially in a Western modern world, especially in America. I guess even especially in Austin, right? I mean, we both live in Austin. Austin is a city where literally, like when you meet a new person, the first question is, well, when did he move here? right? Because everyone just moved
totally.
2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
If you've just moved, then you go, well, where did you move from, right? Because if you came from Kansas, that's very different than if you came from New York, right? Because
Totally.
Whatever your values are depends on where you move from and how much of that you carry here, how much of that
And
is,
what your experience of Austin is. If you're moving from New York, you're going to have a very different experience of Austin. It seems like a small town, right?
Yeah.
If you're coming from Kansas, it seems like a big city, right? And so, yeah, it's a very different perception. I will say, actually, so this is something that really just popped up for me as we're talking about it and is sitting with me, but there is a real sense in which, even in something like a marriage, but any community, any agent arena relationship, in order to belong to it, in order to co-identify, you have to let it define you too. You can't just define it. It also defines you. And there is to some degree a subversion of our sense of individuality in that. Because if you're not letting it define you, participating in it in that way, then you're not a part of that relationship, right? It is a co-identification. And that means that you will not be the same person, maybe, that you would have been without that co-identification. You're letting go. That potential future self is dying off, right? And I think we feel that in marriage for sure, is that like, well, whoever I would have been if I'd stayed single is dying in the process of doing this, right? And now I'm allowing this person to influence me to become different. And I'm not as individual as I was. Now, the same thing is true in the community. If you're going to belong to a community, you cannot be as individual as you were. And for people that are high in openness like we are, that's challenging. I think it is very challenging to allow other people to form our identity for us, right? And to co-identify, but otherwise you don't get it. Right? You don't belong. You don't get meaning. You don't get that sense of connection and belonging and meaning unless you allow that subversion of your individuality to some degree. And that brings me to what we talked about several lectures ago with Aristotle. It's that partial. It's the maybe, or even the Buddhists, the right individuality. Right? It's not full individuality. It's not complete subversion. There's a right amount of individuality that is hard to maybe define. And I think Aristotle gave the example of like bravery being the right balance between cowardice and foolishness or whatever it was, right? There's a line there.
Part of the tension, I mean, you what you were emphasizing over here is like with the sacrificing your individuality for the community, and that's what your emphasis was in what you just said. But I mean, another way of thinking about that is, well, if you find a community that just speaks to you and you resonate with so much, you may be very, very happy and more than willing to give up your individuality because the community speaks to you so deeply. And just a rough example of this is, let's say war breaks out. Let's say you're Ukrainian, right? And here you are, studying whatever, you're in the philosophy department in Ukraine studying existentialism, right? And you have no meaning or purpose. And then Russia invades. And then suddenly you volunteer to be a soldier, right? And that is a community, right? That's literally,
Totally.
And the whole society now becomes your community because you're united around a certain thing, right? And so in that sense, because the community and what the community is trying to achieve is just, in your eyes, so overridingly important, the idea of sacrificing your individuality almost never crosses your mind. It's so obvious that you have to give your life to this thing, that the sacrifice of the individuality, it's like you're slipping off some robes, right? Right before you join. So I mean, what I'm pointing out to you is that you were emphasizing just now how the difficulty or the pain of giving up your individuality, but that's perhaps maybe you haven't interfaced with a community that it just speaks to you just like that, so concretely and deeply that it becomes easy for you to contemplate it. Is where
maybe,
you don't even
but
think twice.
Maybe, but I think even in the writings of people who have engaged in wars that lasted a longer period of time, I think it's very different to engage with that community for 5 years, 2 years, whatever, than a marriage or a community, a religious community, where it's like a lifetime. Because inevitably then there will be that moment where the community asks something of you that is counter to your sense of individuality, right? Not just a moment of sacrifice, not just a temporary sacrifice, but, I mean, disciplining kids. Let's go back to, right? That's not how I would have done it. But am I still going to allow it? Or am I going to say, hey, hands off, you don't get to touch my kids. Don't tell me how to raise my kids, right? But then I'm not belonging to the community, right? So no matter how much resonance there is, it's never perfect resonance. You're never going to find any community that you resonate with perfectly, not even a spouse, right? Mm. And so are you belonging to this marriage? Are you belonging to this relationship? Because if you are, there is the moment where the relationship demands something of you to let go of your individuality and prioritize belonging to that agent arena relationship over time. Maybe not at first. And yeah, you can be infatuated at first and say, oh yeah, you know, I'm so taken with this person. I happily gave up my dreams. I happily, whatever the thing was, right? But 10, 20 years on, you may have a different, you know, that infatuation may be less prominent. And what you're left with is a commitment to that agent arena relationship, the role that you have decided to play, and to say, hey, I am committed to this other person's well-being, right? And trust, not only trust, but have seen that they are committed to mine. But both of us have to let go of some of our individuality. It can't be, and plenty of marriages fail if we feel like it's unfair. Like, oh, I'm committed, but you're not. I'm facilitating your dreams, but you don't give a shit about my dreams, right? Things fall apart if that goes on long enough. It can go on for that's the other interesting thing. There are marriages that drag on for 10 years where one person feels from year 3 the infatuation's over, whatever, and I feel like, hey, I'm doing everything you're not. Well, why did it last 10 years? Because they were committed to the agent arena relationship, and it took that long for them to say, it's so unfair that I'm ending this, I'm going to kill this off, I'm going to let this die and suffer the pain of that, right? But that's commitment. I mean, and that's the right way that it should be, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, year 3, I'm perceiving like it's unfair, fuck you, I'm out, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think how much more so is it difficult, I guess, expanding further from marriage with a community? In our day and age of so much individuality, so much difference, so many different types of people, religions. I mean, we've talked to, you know, if I go to a random, you know, mosque, you know, here and start talking about my religious views, right? Like, there's no community for me there, right?
Right, yeah.
But I'm also not willing to subvert my individuality in order to belong. And so I end up without a community, right?
Yeah,
so I think there's I was just finishing up. I think you have to find a community that resonates enough that you're willing to make that sacrifice. So it can't be a community that's so foreign you have to give up everything that makes you yourself, right? Because you have other agent arena relationships with the world, with your business, with your friends, with your whatever, right? But something that is enough resonant that you're willing to make some sacrifices. And you're not going to find anything that requires no sacrifice.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, the other part of this whole problem is, you know, we are going through these lectures and we're discovering language, right, to describe the contours of the problem, right? But most people are just feeling the angst, right, and they don't really have a clue.
Sure.
That things like community is important. You know, the ideas of frame, ideas of agent arena. I mean, just the idea that you should have meaning in life, right? That's I mean, a lot of people in the Western culture don't really have that figured out, right? Oh, what is wrong, right? Like there's something, I'm feeling some angst here, right? I mean, that's what the job of the Epicureans was, like, hey,
sure,
this is the diagnosis, this is the prescription, right? And then the Stoics came up with an idea, and then the Cynics. In fact, you could argue the Cynics were being provocative in trying to jar people into saying, hey, listen, we've got a meaning crisis, right? There's things to think about here, right?
I mean, and this is why, people like Jordan Peterson or whoever are pointing at this notion is that I think so commonly in our society, the interpretation of that angst is, well, it's because I hate my job. It's because, I don't have enough money. I don't have enough pleasure in life, right? Oh, whatever it is, I am depressed. I have a chemical imbalance. I have whatever. There's all these other answers that people are trying to give because, they don't have this language to say, no. What you're missing is something that makes that. I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about those all the time. You don't have anything to set against the existential suffering of life, right? You need meaning to say, oh, this is what makes that worth it. You can't get away from it. You're going to have existential suffering. But what you can do is say, well, I do have something that makes it worth it. And that's a different thing.
Yeah. Well, that was an optimistic note to end on.
I mean, more than usual. Yeah. Cool, man. All right. Catch you next time.
Good talk. I'll catch you next time.